Victor Ashcombe didn't knock. He never did. The door to Silas Boone's ranch swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and the man who stepped through it wore the kind of smile that had nothing warm inside it, just teeth and intention. He dropped a folded paper on the kitchen table like it was garbage, like the house itself was garbage, like everything inside it already belonged to him. "You've got 30 days, Boone." His voice was low and comfortable, the voice of a man who had never once been told no and had forgotten the word entirely. "Sign it over quiet, or I'll make sure there's nothing left worth signing." He didn't wait for an answer. He never did that either. The door didn't close behind him, just hung open, letting the cold Wyoming air pour in like an insult. And that is the moment everything changed, not just for Silas Boone, for a widow on a train 200 miles away clutching 4 boys, and a letter she had almost thrown away, a letter from a man she had never met, who had answered her honest and desperate proposal with something she hadn't expected from anyone: respect. If you've ever been down to nothing and still had to find a way to stand up, this story is going to live inside you. Stay with me. Because what happens next is going to make you angry, break your heart, and then, if you hold on long enough, give you something back. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The letter had come on a Tuesday, which Hannah Whitlock would remember for the rest of her life, because Tuesdays had always been her worst days. It was Tuesday when the bank man came to the house in Missouri. Tuesday when he set the papers on the table without even sitting down, without even offering to sit down, just standing there in his good coat while she stood in her apron with flour on her hands. And he explained in a very patient and very cold voice that the farm was gone, that James's debts had been building for 2 years before he died, and that she had 30 days to vacate. She had not cried in front of him. She waited until his buggy was gone, and then she went to the kitchen and she cried into a dish towel so her boys wouldn't hear her through the walls. That had been 4 months ago. Since then, Hannah Whitlock, 39 years old, with 4 sons and a trunk full of practical things, and very little else, had done what she had always done when the world fell on her. She figured it out. She sat down at the table after the boys were asleep and she wrote letters. 12 of them, to 12 different men whose names she had found through a frontier matchmaking correspondence service that a neighbor woman had mentioned almost as a joke. They do it out west, Hannah, men who need wives for working ranches. They advertise. And she had written 12 careful, honest letters. She had not promised to be something she wasn't. She had not described herself as beautiful or gentle or easy. She had written the truth. "I'm a widow with 4 sons, ages 7 to 16. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for a fair arrangement. I work hard. My sons work hard. We will not be a burden. We will be an asset. And if you are a man of character who needs help running a working ranch, I believe we could come to an honest agreement." 11 of those letters came back with silence. One came back with something worse. A letter that described, in cheerful and oblivious terms, all the ways he would expect her boys to make themselves useful and all the ways she would need to adjust her expectations regarding comfort and conversation, and which ended with the phrase, "I trust you understand the arrangement." She had understood the arrangement perfectly. She had burned that letter in the stove. And then, 6 weeks after she'd sent the last of them and had nearly given up hope, a letter arrived from Wyoming, from a man named Silas Boone. It was short. That was the first thing that surprised her. "Mrs. Whitlock, I received your letter. I'll be honest with you the same way you were honest with me. This ranch is struggling. I am not an easy man to live with. I don't know much about children, but I read your letter twice and I think you mean what you say. If you still want to come, I'll meet your train. S. Boone." She read it 3 times herself. He hadn't said anything about the boys being a problem. He hadn't said anything about adjusting her expectations. He hadn't called them a burden or a complication or used any of the soft words men used when they meant, "This is a condition I am tolerating." He had just said, "Come." And so she had sold what little the bank hadn't taken, bought 4 train tickets and 1 for herself, and she had loaded her sons and her trunk onto a train headed west. Cole was 16, and he had his father's jaw and his father's stubbornness, which in James Whitlock had been a virtue and in a 16-year-old boy was something Hannah had not yet decided about. He sat across from her on the train with his arms folded and his eyes out the window, and he had been doing that for 2 days. "You don't have to look happy," she told him, sometime around the second afternoon, when the Missouri farmland had given way to the flat and enormous openness of the plains. "Good," he said. "Because I'm not." "Cole?" "I'm just saying what's true, Mama. You don't know this man. We don't know anything about him. He could be—" He stopped, looked at his hands, started again, quieter. "Pa was supposed to be a good man, and look what happened." Hannah was quiet for a moment. Outside, the land was going past them, in that way land did from trains. Too fast to see any one thing clearly, just an impression of distance and sky. "Your father was a good man," she said finally. "He just wasn't careful with money. Those are different things." "And this Boone? You know he's careful?" "I know," he answered honestly when he could have said anything. Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's not much to bet on." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she could see the thing underneath the stubbornness, the fear. He was 16 and he was the oldest, and he felt every ounce of what they were walking into. She knew that. She had always known that about Cole. "We don't have better options," she said. It wasn't soft and it wasn't pretty, and she meant every word of it. "I'm not going to pretend we do." He turned back to the window. Owen, who was 13 and read everything he could get his hands on and worried about things quietly and at length, had been sitting 2 seats back with a book open in his lap that he hadn't turned a page of in an hour. He was listening. He was always listening. Eli, at 10, was currently attempting to teach Micah, the youngest at 7, a card game with rules that seemed to change every 3 hands, and Micah was losing cheerfully and with great enthusiasm, and the two of them filled the back of the car with the particular noise of boys who had not yet learned to be afraid of what was coming. Hannah looked at them and felt, not for the first time, the specific weight of being the only thing between those 4 children and the world. She folded Silas Boone's letter and put it back in her coat pocket, where it had lived for 6 weeks. Come. She had come. Silas Boone was not what she had expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. He was waiting at the station in Coldwater Creek, Wyoming, which was a town that looked like it was still deciding whether to exist. He was standing apart from the small cluster of people on the platform, which she noticed immediately, the way he didn't lean against anything or talk to anyone, just stood with his hat in his hands and watched the train come in. He was taller than she'd imagined. Older, maybe, or just weathered. It was hard to tell with men who worked outdoors. He had a face that looked like it had made peace with not smiling without becoming mean about it. Just still. Like he'd been standing in that same stillness for a long time. She came down the steps with Micah's hand in hers, and Cole 1 step behind her, and she walked toward him, and he walked toward her, and they stopped a few feet apart, and neither of them said anything for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Boone." He looked past her at the boys, all 4 of them, Cole with his arms still folded, Owen watching carefully, Eli already glancing around the platform with open curiosity, Micah pressing himself slightly into Hannah's side. Something moved across Silas Boone's face. She couldn't name it exactly. Not disappointment, not the quick calculation she'd seen on men who were doing math in their heads. Something more like recognition. Like he'd been told something was going to be hard and was now looking at how hard and deciding it was about what he'd been told. "Long ride?" he asked. 2 days, she said. He nodded. He looked at the trunk being unloaded behind her. "That everything?" "That's everything." He picked it up without asking, just walked to the wagon with it. She stood for a moment watching him, and then Cole said quietly, from behind her, "Well." "Well," she agreed. The ranch was 9 miles outside of town, and by the time they got there the sun was getting low, and the light was going gold, and slanted across land that was, Hannah had to admit, a long way from nothing. Rolling grass that the wind moved through like something breathing, fence lines stretching out further than she could follow, a mountain ridge in the distance that looked painted. But the house looked like a man who had given up on himself. not beyond saving. She was careful to think it that way and not worse, but the porch had boards that needed replacing. The window on the left side of the front had a crack patched with cloth. And the yard was the kind of overgrown that happens not from laziness, but from someone who has stopped having enough hours in a day and has started choosing what gets done and what doesn't, and the yard lost. She could see Cole looking at it. She could see him cataloging. Silas pulled the wagon up and climbed down and stood looking at the house himself for a moment, like he was trying to see it from the outside for the first time in a while. "It's not much," he said. "It's shelter," she said. He looked at her. "You say that like you mean it." "I spent the last 3 months in a boarding house with 4 boys in 2 rooms. Mr. Boone, anything with a yard is a palace." Something shifted in his face again. Not a smile exactly. More like a wall moving back 1 inch. "Kitchen's in the back," he said. "I'll show you where things are." The first night was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, because nothing went wrong was somehow harder. There was no shouting, no coldness, no moment that confirmed Cole's fears or anyone else's. Silas showed them the house with the economy of a man who did not narrate things, just moved from room to room and indicated things. Here's where the water is. Here's where the wood is stacked. The boys will sleep there. There's an extra blanket in the chest. He made them supper himself that night, beans and cornbread and coffee for the adults, which was not much but was hot, and he set it on the table without comment, and they all sat down, and there was a silence that was not comfortable but was also not hostile, and Hannah found herself in the strange position of not knowing which would have been easier to navigate. Micah, who had been quiet since the station, looked up from his beans and said to Silas, "Do you have any animals?" Silas looked at the boy. Just looked at him for a moment. "Got horses," he said. "Few chickens, dog somewhere." Micah's eyes got wide. "What kind of dog?" "Ugly kind." "What's his name?" "Biscuit." Eli made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, immediately suppressed. Even Owen's mouth moved. Colt was looking at the table. Silas said, without looking up from his bowl, "Dog will find you in the morning, finds everyone." Micah nodded seriously, like this had been an important exchange of information. Hannah watched all of it and said nothing and thought, this is the thing you can't see in a letter, whether a man will speak plainly to a child without making it a performance. It wasn't much, but she put it in the same place she put the letter. Come. She couldn't sleep. It was past midnight and the house was quiet, and she was lying in the room Silas had given her, his own room, she realized, because the bed was the only one in the house large enough for an adult, and he had set himself up in the small room off the kitchen without making any mention of it. And she was staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things she hadn't let herself think about on the train, because thinking about them on the train would have undone her. She did not know this man. She knew he was not unkind. She knew he was not a talker. She knew he had given her his room and made supper and spoken to her youngest son about a dog without impatience. She did not know what he expected. She did not know how long his patience lasted. She did not know what was underneath the stillness, whether it was steadiness or something else, something that had just learned to go quiet. She did not know if she had made a catastrophic mistake. She lay there a long time with that question, because it was the only honest thing to do with it. She didn't pray it away or talk herself out of it. She just let it sit there with her in the dark. And then, because she was Hannah Whitlock and she had lain in the dark with worse things than this, she let it sit there until it got a little smaller, and then she closed her eyes. In the morning, she told herself she would get up and she would find out what needed doing and she would start doing it. That was what she had. That was what she had always had. She was up before sunrise. Silas was already in the yard when she pushed open the back door. She could see him in the early gray light, moving between the fence posts at the far end of the property, checking something. He hadn't heard her or didn't show it. She built the fire and put the coffee on and stood in the kitchen looking out at the land, and for the first time since the bankman had come in, his good coat, she felt something that wasn't exactly hope, but was shaped like it. Like the land before the sun hits it. Just the outline of something, not the thing yet. The coffee started, and the boys started waking up in the way boys did. Not all at once, but in a cascade, Micah first, stumbling into the kitchen with his hair ridiculous. then Eli close behind, then Owen appearing in the doorway with a book already tucked under his arm, and finally Cole, who moved through the morning like he was carrying something heavy and was trying not to let anyone see. Cole stopped when he saw her at the window. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. He looked out at the yard, at Silas still moving along the fence line. "He's been out there since before I got up," Cole said. "Man's got a lot of fence to check." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I'll go see if he needs help." She turned and looked at her son. He was still looking out the window, jaw set, not looking at her. 16 years old and trying so hard to hold everything up with his bare hands. "Cole," she said quietly. "Don't," he said. "Don't make it a thing. I'm just going to help with the fence." She let him go. She watched through the window as he crossed the yard and came up alongside Silas, and she watched Silas turn, and she couldn't see their faces from this distance, but she saw Cole reach out and take one end of the fence post Silas had been wrestling with, and she saw Silas go still for a moment and then nod, and together they set the post. It was, she thought, a very small thing. It was also, she thought, almost everything. She found the ledger that afternoon. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been cleaning out the back storage room because it needed doing, and because having her hands busy was the best thing for her head, and it had been tucked behind a box of old tools. A ranch ledger, years' worth of accounts in someone else's handwriting, and then Silas's handwriting starting partway through, the numbers getting sparser and then more crossed out as the years went on. She sat down on the floor of that storage room and read through it because she had always been the one who kept the accounts in the Whitlock house, because James had been better with land than numbers, and she read through it with the particular attention of a woman who had watched her own household accounts go wrong without knowing until it was too late. And what she saw made her chest tighten. The ranch wasn't just struggling. It was a few seasons from gone. Not from anything Silas had done wrong, exactly, more from the accumulation of small bad years, a beef price that had dropped, one winter that had hit harder than expected, a fence line that ran 3 miles in the wrong direction from where the water was, small errors and bad luck stacked on top of each other until the math just didn't work. She sat with that for a while. And then she got up and put the ledger back where she'd found it and went back to the kitchen and started on supper, because today was not the day to talk about it. Today was the 3rd day. They were still finding out where the spoons were, but she tucked the numbers in the back of her mind and she left them there. And when she lay in Silas Boone's room again that night, she was not afraid anymore. She was something else now. She was making plans. The plans Hannah made in the dark had a way of looking different in daylight, but they didn't get smaller. They got more specific. She had not said anything to Silas about the ledger for 3 more days. She watched first. That was the way she had always operated. Watch, then talk, because talking before watching was how people wasted words and goodwill, and she didn't have much surplus of either right now. She watched how Silas moved through the ranch, what he checked first in the morning, what he left until last, which fence lines he walked, and which he didn't. How he talked to the horses, which was more than he talked to anyone else, and without any self-consciousness about it, just easy conversation like they were colleagues with a shared problem. She watched the boys too. Eli had found Biscuit by the 2nd morning, exactly as Silas had predicted, the dog materializing from somewhere behind the barn and planting himself next to Eli with the calm certainty of an animal who had already decided. Biscuit was, in fact, ugly, some combination of breeds that had produced a brown and gray creature with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, and a tail that worked twice as hard as it needed to. Eli loved him immediately and completely. Micah trailed after Silas at a distance of about 20 feet for the first 2 days, not close enough to be intrusive, not far enough that Silas couldn't see him if he looked. Silas looked, several times. He didn't tell Micah to go back inside. He didn't make a show of acknowledging him either. He just went on doing what he was doing, and eventually Micah closed the distance to 10 feet and then to 5. And by the end of day 3, he was handing Silas tools without being asked, because he had been watching long enough to know which one came next. Owen read the ranch the way he read books, cover to cover, nothing skipped. He walked every fence line in the first week, not working, just walking, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on everything. Hannah saw Silas watching him do this from across the yard once, with an expression she still couldn't fully read, something between puzzled and careful. And Cole worked. Hard, deliberate, jaw-set work. The kind that had something to prove in it, but was real work underneath the proving. He and Silas had established a morning routine without discussing it. Cole appearing at the fence line, Silas already there, and the two of them moving along it together in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable and started being something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was the early shape of one. On the fourth morning, Hannah put the ledger on the kitchen table before Silas came in for coffee. He saw it, stopped in the doorway. His face went very still in a specific way, the way faces go still when they recognize something they've been avoiding. "Where'd you find that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Storage room. I was cleaning." He came in and sat down and didn't reach for the ledger. Just looked at it. Hannah poured his coffee and sat across from him and let the silence run its course. "How bad is it?" she said finally. He exhaled through his nose. "Depends on the winter." "I did the math, Silas." He looked up at her. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and they both noticed it, but she didn't take it back and he didn't comment on it. "2 bad winters in a row finishes you," she said. "1 bad winter and a dry spring does the same thing. You've been spending on feed what you should be spending on infrastructure, which makes sense because you had to, but the fence on the east side is costing you cattle every season and you probably already know that." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know that. The water situation is the main problem. Also know that. So what's the plan?" He looked at her in a way that was somewhere between irritated and something else. "I was managing. I'm not saying you weren't. I'm asking what the plan is." "The plan," he said slowly, "was to get through this season and reassess in spring." "That's not a plan. That's hoping." The muscle in his jaw moved. She watched it. She had pushed, and she knew she'd pushed, and she held her ground anyway, because she had not come 900 miles to be polite about the thing that was going to put them all back on the street. "I've been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. "I know, and I've been running a household on too little for longer than that. I'm not criticizing what you've done. I'm telling you what I see." She pushed the ledger toward him an inch. "Look at the waterline entries. The cost runs higher every dry season because you're hauling from the creek instead of running pipe. If Owen and Cole help me dig the line in before fall, that's a 3-week job. Then we should have started talking about it 3 days ago." He stared at her. She stared back. Something in him shifted. She could see it, the wall moving back again, the same inch it had moved on the platform when she'd said anything with a yard as a palace. He picked up the ledger and opened it, and they sat at that kitchen table for the next hour going through numbers. And it was not comfortable, but it was honest. And honest was what they had. The town of Coldwater Creek had opinions about the Whitlock woman. Hannah knew this the first time she went in for supplies, 2 weeks after arriving. She could feel it in the way the conversation at the general store shifted when she walked through the door, the way the woman behind the counter, Martha Tilden, she learned later, who knew everyone's business because her store was where everyone came, looked at her with that particular expression that was friendly on the outside and measuring underneath. "You're the woman out at Boone's place," Martha said, like it was a fact she was checking. "Hannah Whitlock, yes. With the 4 boys." "That's right." Martha handed over the flour Hannah had asked for. "How are you finding it out there?" "Lot of work to do," Hannah said pleasantly. Martha leaned on the counter slightly. "Silas is a quiet man, keeps to himself. Folks were surprised when they heard he'd sent for someone. He didn't exactly send for me. We corresponded. However it came about." Martha folded her hands. "He's a decent man. Just want you to know folks here think well of him. Been through some hard years." Hannah looked at her steadily. "So have I." Martha held her gaze for a moment, and then something in her relaxed slightly, the measuring quality settling into something more like actual curiosity. "Well, if you need anything, you let me know." It was not warmth exactly, but it was an opening. Hannah took it. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't know for another week, was what the man in the corner of that store had been listening to while she and Martha talked. She hadn't paid much attention to him, just registered a broad-shouldered figure near the back, buying something, apparently minding his own business. His name was Victor Ashcombe, and he had been minding anything but. Then, Owen found the problem with the cattle records on a Thursday evening, which was just another evening to everyone else, but would later mark the point at which everything changed. He had been given the task of helping organize the storage room after Hannah's initial clean, and because Owen organized things the way he did everything, thoroughly and with attention to what didn't fit, he had pulled out every paper in that room and sorted it, and noticed that the tally records from the previous 2 seasons didn't match the ledger. Not by a small amount, by 43 head of cattle. He brought it to Hannah first, not to Silas, because he wasn't entirely sure what it meant, and he knew his mother would know, and he was right. She looked at the numbers and looked at him and said, "You're sure?" "I counted 3 times. Does Silas know about this?" "I don't think so. The records are in different places. You'd have to compare them deliberately." She thought about this for a moment. "Don't say anything to the others tonight. I'll talk to Silas in the morning." Owen nodded. He was about to go and then stopped. "Mama, if cattle have been going missing and it's not in the records..." "I know. Someone inside or outside would have to..." "Owen, I know." She touched his arm briefly. "You did well finding it. Go on to bed." He went, but he didn't sleep well, and in the morning he was at the table early when Hannah spoke to Silas, and he watched Silas's face go through something that was hard to look at. Confusion first, then the particular sick quality of a man realizing something has been happening in his own house without his knowledge. Silas went through the records himself. Then he went through them again. Then he set them down with care, like they might break, and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "Hank," he said. "Who's Hank?" Hannah asked. "Hank Draper. Been working for me 6 years." He said it quietly, with the flatness of a man absorbing a blow. "Manages the cattle tally." The kitchen was very quiet. "You don't know it's him," Hannah said carefully. "No, I don't know." He stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back. "I need to ride out." "Silas? I'm not going to do anything." He said it like he was reminding himself as much as her. "I just need to look at the South pasture count myself. That's all." He left without his coffee. Hannah watched him go through the window, the same window she'd watched Cole cross the yard toward him 2 weeks ago, and she thought about the difference between the things you could fix with work and the things that were already broken and had been for a while without anyone knowing. Cole was 17 feet up a fence post repair when Victor Ashcombe rode onto the property for the first time. Cole didn't know who he was. He saw a well-dressed man on a good horse come through the gate and ride toward the house without slowing, like he owned the road and was considering the property. There was something in the way he moved, the horse, the posture, all of it, that made Cole's neck prickle. He climbed down. By the time he reached the yard, Ashcombe had already dismounted and Hannah was on the porch, wiping her hands on a cloth, watching him come up the path. "Mrs. Whitlock." He said her name like he'd known it for longer than was comfortable. He smiled. "Victor Ashcombe. My ranch borders Silas's land to the north. Wanted to come introduce myself. Welcome you proper. Mr. Ashcombe." She did not come down the porch steps. Cole noticed that. She stayed up 1 step and made him look up at her slightly, and he didn't know if she'd done it on purpose or not, but he thought she probably had. "Silas isn't here right now." "That's all right. It's you I wanted to meet, frankly." He glanced around the yard at the new fence sections Cole had been working on, at the waterline stakes Owen had set out that morning. "Looks like you're making some changes. Looks like we're fixing what needs fixing." He looked at Cole then, a thorough look, the kind that categorized. "This one of yours?" "My son Cole." Ashcombe nodded at him, the nod of a man acknowledging furniture. Cole felt heat rise in his neck, but kept his face still. "You know," Ashcombe said, turning back to Hannah with the ease of a man who had never been uncomfortable in his life, "Silas has been having a rough go of it out here. I've made him offers on this land before. Fair offers. He's a stubborn man." "Most good ranchers are," Hannah said. Ashcombe smiled wider. "You should know, if things don't work out here, I'm a man who makes generous arrangements for everyone involved. That's very kind, Hannah said, in a voice that meant nothing of the sort. I'll let Silas know you called. After he left, after that good horse carried him back through the gate and down the road, Cole came up the porch steps and stood next to his mother, and they both watched the road for a moment. You don't like him, Cole said. I just met him. Mama, she exhaled. No, I don't like him. He looked at the stakes Owen set. I know he did. Cole thought about this. He wasn't just being neighborly. People who are just being neighborly don't come calling when they know the man of the house is out, she said. They come when they know he's home. Cole looked at her. She was still watching the road. What do we do? He asked. Right now? You finish the fence. I'm going to start supper. And tonight I'm going to tell Silas who came by. And then? And then we see what kind of man Victor Ashcombe really is. She turned and went inside. I suspect we won't have to wait long. She was right about that. They didn't have to wait long at all. The first cut fence appeared 10 days later on the east pasture line. Silas found it in the morning and fixed it and said nothing because single-cut fences happened, posts rotted, wire went brittle. It was the third one in 2 weeks that made him go quiet in the way that was different from his usual quiet. He told Hannah over supper, with the boys at the table. He'd started doing that, telling her things at supper, with the boys there, not excluding them. She had noticed it and filed it away. Third section in 2 weeks, he said. Same spot each time. East line near the ridge. Someone's cutting them, Cole said immediately. Could be. Could be, but you think it is, Cole said. Silas looked at him. I know how you said that. It's the same way my mother says could be when she knows exactly what it is. There was a silence, and then Eli made a small sound that might have been a laugh, and Micah looked at Silas to see how he would take it, and Silas looked at Cole for a moment with something in his face that was as close to a smile as he got. Third cut in the same location isn't an accident, Silas said. What do we do? Owen asked. He had a piece of bread in his hand and his eyes on Silas like he was taking notes. Fix it and watch. That's what you've been doing, Hannah said. Yes. How long have you been watching? He was quiet for a moment. Since before you got here. She looked at him. The cattle records. I didn't know what was in the records yet, but things were adding up wrong for too long. I just didn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't know what I was dealing with. Do you know now? He set his fork down, looked at the table, looked up. I think Victor Ashcombe has been helping himself to my cattle for 2 seasons. I think someone on this property has been letting him do it, and I think the fence cutting is him reminding me that he can do worse. The table was very quiet. Micah said, Is he going to hurt us? It was the kind of question that could crack a room in half. 7 years old and asking the thing no one else had said out loud. Hannah opened her mouth and Silas got there first. Not while I'm here, Silas said, flat and certain. Not a performance, just a fact. Micah looked at him for a moment, weighing it the way children weighed things, against some internal measure that was simpler and more accurate than most adults gave it credit for. Then he nodded and picked up his fork. Cole caught Hannah's eye across the table. She couldn't tell what was in his face. He looked away before she could figure it out. What? Owen found the second ledger 3 weeks later, and this one was not on the Boone property. He had gone to town with Hannah for supplies, and while she was at Tilden's store, he had gone to the land office because he had started doing that, reading posted notices, looking at land records the way another kid his age might read dime novels, because Owen had always been more interested in the systems underneath things than the things themselves. And in the land office, there was a young clerk named Thomas, who was bored and talkative, and who, once Owen started asking careful and seemingly innocent questions, said more than he probably should have. He told Owen, without saying it directly, that there had been filings on several properties in the area in the past 2 years. Water rights adjustments, land boundary amendments, small things, the kind that looked like paperwork on the surface and under the surface moved lines and rights in directions that all happened to benefit the same party. Owen asked the name of that party as if he were just curious. The clerk told him. Owen walked back to the store and found his mother and did not say a word until they were in the wagon heading home. And then he told her everything quietly and in order, the way he always told things. Hannah drove the whole 9 miles home without saying much, just sat with it. And when she got back to the ranch and Silas came out to help unload, she handed him the reins and said, "We need to talk. Not in front of the boys." They stood in the barn while the horses settled, and she told him what Owen had found. Silas was quiet for a long time. "He's been filing on the water rights," he said finally. "Not yet on yours. But the 2 ranches east of you, Alderman's and the Price Widow's land, those filings went through 6 months ago. They might not even know what they signed." He leaned against the barn wall. He had the look of a man who had suspected something bad and found out it was worse. "Alderman's been talking about selling. Thought it was his choice." "It might not have been. Not entirely." He put his hat back on his head and looked at the roof of the barn for a moment. "Hannah, what are we walking into?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the bankman in his good coat, and the boarding house in 2 rooms, and the letter she'd almost thrown away. "Something we need to be smarter than," she said finally. "Not tougher, smarter." He looked at her. "Victor Ashcombe is a man who uses lawyers and ledgers and other people doing his dirty work," she said. "He's not going to come at you with a gun. He's going to come at you with paper, and by the time the paper lands, you need to already have better paper ready." "I'm a rancher. I don't know the first thing about—" "Owen does," she said. "Or he will. That boy reads like his life depends on it, and right now maybe it does." She held Silas's gaze. "Let me handle this part. You keep the ranch running. Let Owen dig into the county records. Let Cole keep the fence line. Give me time to figure out what Ashcomb's actually built and where the holes are." "Why?" he said. Not dismissively, genuinely. "You've been here 6 weeks. You could walk away from this." "I could," she said. "So why won't you?" She thought of Micah asking, "Is he going to hurt us?" and Silas saying, "Not while I'm here," with that flat certainty. And she thought of Cole with the fence post, and Owen in the land office asking careful questions, and Eli's laugh filling up the kitchen at breakfast like the house had forgotten what that sounded like. "Because my boys are already here," she said. "They're already inside this, and I don't walk away from what's mine." Silas looked at her for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and Biscuit barked once at something, and then went quiet. "All right," he said. The summer turned hard in the way Wyoming summers did, not with heat, but with dry, the kind that cracked the ground and made the water haul longer every week. The pipe project Hannah and Silas had planned came together badly and slowly. 3 wrong estimates, 1 section that had to be redug after Owen realized the slope was wrong, a week when the rented equipment broke, and they lost 6 days. Cole lost his temper twice during that period. Once at the equipment, which was fair, and once at Owen, which was not. And he apologized for the second one in the evening in that stiff way of his, not enough words, but genuine. Silas watched the apology without saying anything, and later that night Hannah heard them in the yard. Silas and Cole. Not the words, but the low back and forth of it, the particular rhythm of 2 people working something out. She didn't go to the window. She let it be. The water line went in on a Friday in late July, and it wasn't pretty. 1 section ran slightly crooked and 1 connection leaked until Owen spent 2 hours tightening it. But water ran from the line to the trough and didn't stop. And that evening, Silas stood at the trough and put his hand under the running water and just stood there for a moment, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. She did not say anything about that either. Some moments needed to be private even when you were standing right next to them. Eli organized a celebration that nobody had asked for, which consisted of cornbread and terrible lemonade that was mostly water, and a card game that lasted until Micah fell asleep at the table and had to be carried in. Silas carried him. He came back into the kitchen after, and Owen and Eli and Cole were still at the table, and he sat down and picked up his cards and didn't make anything of it, and neither did the boys. And it was the kind of nothing that was actually something large. And Hannah looked at the 4 of them and felt the shape of something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was home. So she pushed that feeling away almost immediately because she could not afford it yet. Ashcombe had not moved on the water rights for the Boone property, but Owen had found 3 more filings in the county records, all adjacent landowners, all small, all showing the same careful pattern of paperwork that moves slowly enough not to alarm anyone and fast enough to be done before anyone noticed. Whatever Ashcombe was building, it was bigger than one ranch. And then, in August, Owen came home from a second trip to the county records office, this time with Thomas the clerk nervous and less talkative, with something that made Hannah set down everything she was doing. The cattle transactions going back 3 years. The sales records. Owen had found the ledger Hank Draper had been keeping, not at the ranch, but at a trading post 30 miles south, filed under a company name that didn't belong to Silas Boone but shared 2 of the same cattle brands. Victor Ashcombe's name was not on the document, but the company name was owned by his brother-in-law, who lived in Laramie and had never in his life operated a cattle concern. He's been laundering Silas's cattle, Owen said, through a company that technically exists but doesn't actually operate. He takes the cattle, files the sale under the fake company, and the money goes somewhere else. Can you prove it? The brands are provable. Anyone can see the brands. But the company connection, I need more records. The trading post doesn't keep records long. I'd need to find where the money actually went. He paused. Thomas might help. He's nervous, but I think he knows more than he said. Hannah thought about this. Owen, you need to be careful with that clerk. If Ashcombe has people watching the land office, I know. But do you? He looked at her steadily, 13 years old with his father's eyes, and something in him that was entirely his own. Mama, I know what I'm doing. She looked at her son and thought, no, you don't. Not entirely. None of us do. But she also thought, he's closer to knowing than most men twice his age. One more trip, she said. And you don't go alone. Take Cole. Cole will hover. Cole will make sure you get home. She held his gaze. One more trip. Then we bring what we have to Silas and we figure out the next step together. Owen agreed, reluctantly, the way he agreed to things he knew were right but didn't like. And that night, when the house was quiet and Silas had gone to check the horses one last time as he always did, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with the numbers Owen had copied out, and she spread them in front of her, and she looked at the shape of what Victor Ashcombe had been building for years, patient and quiet and piece by piece. And she felt something cold move through her chest. He was not just stealing from Silas. He was dismantling the entire valley, one small property at a time, so slowly that no one ranch owner would ever see the whole picture, because each of them would only ever see their own little piece of a loss they'd think was bad luck or their own failure. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up Owen's copied records and started organizing them in the way that made the most sense. Not ranch by ranch, the way Owen had arranged them, but date by date, so that the pattern became visible, so that you could see the whole shape of it at once. She worked until the lamp started to flicker. When Silas came in from the horses and found her still at the table, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and then at the papers, and then back at her. How bad? He said. She looked up at him. We need to talk to the aldermans, she said, and the price woman, and whoever else he's been at. Before he files on your water rights, and he will file, Silas, maybe before winter, they need to see this. He came to the table and sat down, and she turned the papers so he could read them. She watched his face as he read. He did not say anything for a long time. When he finally looked up, there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not anger exactly, though there was that underneath. Something more like the look of a man who has been alone with a problem for a long time and has just realized he isn't anymore. All right, he said. What do you need from me? Outside, the Wyoming night was very dark and very large, the way it always was out there, and the wind moved through the grass and the water ran steady through the new pipeline to the trough, and inside the house 4 boys slept without knowing yet what was coming for all of them. Hannah spread the papers flat on the table. Time, she said, and every honest person in this valley who's had enough. The aldermans came on a Wednesday. Hannah had not been sure they would come at all. She had sent a letter through Martha Tilden's store, the only way to pass something along in this valley without it going through channels she no longer trusted, and she had written it carefully, the same way she'd written the letter to Silas months ago. No flourishes, no alarm, just, we have found something you should see. Please come when you can. Bring no one you haven't known for 10 years. Gerald Alderman was 61 and looked older, a man the land had been using hard for 3 decades. He came with his wife Ruth, who was small and sharp-eyed and said almost nothing during the first hour, and then said several things that mattered more than everything else combined. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Hannah had spread Owen's papers the night before, and she laid it out for them the same way she'd laid it out for Silas. Date by date, pattern by pattern. Gerald looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. "He filed on our water rights in March," he finally said. "I know," Hannah said. "We thought it was a clerical. We thought it was an error." He stopped. His wife put her hand over his on the table, briefly, and took it back. "We were told it was an error." "By who?" Silas asked. Gerald looked at him. "By Ashcomb's man, who came by to let us know there'd been a mix-up and it was being sorted." "Was it sorted?" "We never heard back." Gerald's voice had gone flat. "I kept meaning to go check at the land office, and then winter came, and then spring, and the cattle kept us—" He stopped again, looked at his hands. "I let it go." "He counted on that," Hannah said, not unkindly. "He does this slowly enough that it looks like paperwork and inconvenience, and nothing worth losing sleep over until it's too late to fight it." Ruth Alderman had been reading one of Owen's copied pages. She set it down precisely. "Who did the work on these records?" she asked. "My son, Owen." Ruth looked at Owen, who was sitting in the corner of the kitchen because Hannah had told him he could stay if he was quiet. He was 13 and trying very hard to look like he wasn't holding his breath. "How old are you?" Ruth asked. 13, he said. She looked at him for another moment. "You have a good eye." Owen's ears went red. He looked at the floor. "The question," Silas said, bringing it back, "is what we do with it. We have patterns. We have dates that suggest intent. What we don't have is direct evidence connecting Ashcombe to the filings." "His brother-in-law's company," Owen started, "is a connection we'd need a lawyer to argue what," Hannah said, "which means we need more than suggestion. We need a clear line." Gerald looked up. "Thomas Reeves, the clerk at the land office." Everyone looked at him. "He came to me," Gerald said slowly, 6 months ago. Came to the house, not the store, not the office. Said he was worried about some filings. I didn't know what he was talking about, and I told him to go through proper channels." He exhaled. "I think I scared him off." Owen sat forward. "He knows something." "He knows something, and he's been waiting for someone to actually listen," Hannah said. She looked at Silas. He looked back at her, and she could see the same thought moving through him that was moving through her. "I'll go to town tomorrow," Silas said. "Not you," Hannah said. "Owen." Silas frowned. "He's 13, T. He's the one Thomas already half talked to, and Thomas is nervous around authority. Owen doesn't look like authority." She glanced at her son. "You look like a boy doing homework." Owen, to his credit, did not look offended by this. He looked like he was already thinking about what questions to ask. Hank Draper was gone by the time they realized he'd been warned. Silas had been watching him for weeks, not obviously, not in any way that announced itself, just the way a man watches something he's not sure about yet, checking the cattle tally against his own count, noting when Hank lingered near the east fence or came back from a ride 20 minutes later than made sense. He had not confronted him yet because Hannah had asked him not to, because confronting Hank before they had the full picture might warn Ashcombe that they were building one. But someone warned Ashcombe anyway. On a Tuesday morning, Hannah's bad luck day, though she tried not to think of it that way, Hank's bunk was empty, and his horse was gone, and the only thing he'd left behind was a coffee cup on the stove, still faintly warm when Eli found it. Silas stood in the empty bunk room for a long moment. Cole was behind him. Hannah appeared in the doorway. "He ran," Cole said. "He was told to run," Silas said. His voice was controlled in the specific way of a man keeping something tamped down. "Which means someone told Ashcombe we were getting close." "Thomas," Cole said immediately. "We don't know that," Hannah said. "He's the only one who knew." Owen hadn't told Thomas anything specific yet. Owen had only asked general questions. She kept her voice even. Whoever warned Ashcombe knew enough to spook Hank. That means they know more than a nervous clerk. Silas looked at her. Someone else on the property. She held his gaze. I think so. Yes. Cole made a sound in his throat. So we have a spy and a missing witness, and Ashcombe knows we're watching him. Yes, Hannah said. So what do we do? We move faster, she said. Whatever we were going to do slowly, we do it now. But Owen found Thomas Reeves at his boarding house, not at the land office, because Owen had figured out that Thomas took his lunch at the boarding house on Tuesdays and Thursdays when Mrs. Reiner made her beef stew, and Thomas was a man of particular habits, and sometimes knowing a person's habits was worth more than a formal introduction. Cole waited outside, which he hated, but he waited. Owen sat down across from Thomas in the dining room with his own bowl of stew. He'd paid for it because you couldn't sit in Mrs. Reiner's dining room without ordering something. He had looked at the situation and planned for that. And he said, without preamble, Mr. Alderman told us you came to see him 6 months ago, about some filings. Thomas went very still. He was 26, thin, with the look of a man who had spent a long time knowing something he wasn't sure what to do with. He looked around the dining room, 3 other men at the far table not paying attention. I shouldn't talk about land office business, Thomas said. You went to Gerald Alderman's house, Owen said. That's not land office business. That's something you did yourself. Thomas looked at his stew. I'm not going to put you in a bad position, Owen said. I just need to know if what we found in the public records is what you think it is. I'm not asking you to tell me anything that isn't already there. I just need to know if I'm reading it right. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. How old are you? 13? 13. He said it like he was doing math. Who's behind you on this? Silas Boone, Gerald Alderman, and my mother. Your mother. Hannah Whitlock. She's the one who put the dates in order. Something moved across Thomas's face. Recognition, maybe? Or the thing that happens when a person realizes they have not been as alone as they thought. The filings follow a pattern, Thomas said carefully. In my opinion, which I am not stating officially, they follow a pattern that I noticed 18 months ago, and I documented my concerns internally, and those documents were… He stopped. They were not there when I looked for them 3 months later. Owen sat very still. Someone removed your records. I can't prove that. They might have been misfiled. But you don't think they were misfiled. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then quietly, No, I don't think they were misfiled. Owen nodded. He took a spoonful of stew like they were just 2 people having lunch. The company name on the cattle transactions, Hartwell Cattle and Trade. Do you know it? Thomas's jaw moved. It was registered in Laramie. The man who registered it is Ashcombe's brother-in-law. Thomas said nothing. Is there a direct record connecting Ashcombe to Hartwell? Owen asked. Not in the county records. But somewhere, Thomas picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. There was a transaction record that came through the land office 8 months ago. It wasn't a filing. It came through by accident, I think, as part of a packet of documents that should have gone somewhere else. A private transfer of funds. The originating account… He stopped. Started again. I copied it, before it was collected, because I had a feeling. Owen's heart was doing something loud inside his chest that he was carefully not showing on his face. You still have the copy? It's not here. But you still have it. Thomas looked at him. If I give you what I have, what happens to me? I don't know, Owen said honestly. I can't promise you anything I don't know for certain. But I can tell you that if we're right about what Ashcombe is doing, the only thing that keeps any of us safe is making it too public to bury. Thomas was quiet for a long time, long enough that Owen started to think he'd lost him. Then Thomas said, Come to the land office at closing time on Friday, after everyone else has gone. Come to the back door. Owen nodded. He finished his stew. He left a fair tip for Mrs. Reiner. Outside, Cole was leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his eyes on the street. Well, he said. Friday, Owen said. Cole looked at him. He's going to help? I think so. Owen started walking toward the wagon. Don't look pleased. Look like we just had lunch. Cole fell into step beside him, and he did try to look neutral, but his jaw had unclenched, and Owen counted that as good enough. The blizzard came before Friday. Wyoming weather in September was not supposed to do what this storm did, but Wyoming weather did not particularly care about supposed to. It came in from the northwest on a Thursday night, and by morning the world outside the windows was white and loud, and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 8 hours. Silas had seen it coming the night before. Something in the sky, he'd said, and Hannah had learned enough by now to trust the things Silas saw in that sky, and they'd spent Wednesday evening getting the animals in and the wood stacked and the water line checked, and when the storm hit they were as ready as you could be, which was not entirely ready because no one was entirely ready for what this storm was. By noon Thursday, they had 2 feet of snow and it was still coming. By evening, they had lost a section of the roof over the storage room, which Cole and Silas had covered with boards and canvas in the howling wind, while Hannah stood at the door holding a lamp and Owen held the rope tied to Cole's waist in case visibility dropped to nothing, which it did, twice, and both times Owen felt the rope and didn't let go. Micah had been stationed at the kitchen stove, which was his job, which Silas had given him as a real job and not a make-work job. Keep the fire, keep the coffee hot, keep the lamp oil filled, and Micah had done it with the seriousness of someone who understood that the job mattered. Eli had done what Eli always did in a crisis, which was talk. He talked to Micah about nothing, about the card game they were going to play when this was over, about what he thought Biscuit was dreaming about in the corner, about whether the chickens were okay in the coop, and his voice was the specific kind of noise that kept a room from tipping into fear. And Hannah, when she thought about it later, thought that might have been Eli's real gift. Not cheerfulness exactly, but the ability to fill silence with something warm enough to hold the cold back. The storm did not stop. It went through Thursday night and into Friday and showed no signs of hurrying. Friday morning, Cole went out to check the horses. He did not come back. Well, an hour. Hannah stood at the window for an hour telling herself it was fine. He was checking on something. He'd found something that needed fixing. Cole was always finding things that needed fixing. Silas came in from the barn twice, and she told him Cole hadn't come back. And the second time she said it, Silas looked at her face and went back out without putting on another layer. Owen stood in the kitchen doorway. He went to the east pasture. Hannah turned. What? Before he went out, he said something to me about the cattle in the east pasture if they'd gotten into the drift by the ridge. Owen's voice was careful and steady, and she could see him working to keep it that way. I told him to wait for Silas, and he said it wouldn't take long. The east pasture was a quarter mile in good weather. In this, it was something else entirely. Why didn't you... She stopped. Owen's face told her he had already asked himself every version of that question. It's all right, Owen. It was not all right, but she said it, and he nodded. Silas came back in for a rope and another lamp, and he didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he didn't have to. He was going out in a blizzard after a 16-year-old boy who had done the exact kind of stubborn, well-intentioned, alone thing that a 16-year-old with something to prove would do, and they both knew it. I'll come with you, Owen said. No, Silas said. You can't. I need you here. If I'm not back in 2 hours, you ride for the aldermans. He tied the rope around his waist, the other end to the porch post. The rope was 60 feet, nowhere near the east pasture. This is how I go. When the rope runs out, I tie off and go back in to get more, understood? He looked at Hannah when he said it. Not at Owen, at her. She held his gaze. Understood. He went. She stood at the window and could not see him after the first 30 feet. The kitchen was very quiet. Eli had stopped talking. Micah was holding Biscuit in his lap with his face pressed into the dog's neck, and Biscuit, who was ugly and old and wiser than he looked, was very still and let him. Owen stood with his arms folded and his back to the room and his eyes on the window, and after a while he said without turning around, Cole is too stubborn to freeze. I know, Hannah said. He found somewhere to shelter. He's smart enough for that. I know, Owen. Owen stopped. He pressed his forehead briefly against the glass and then straightened and turned around, and his eyes were red at the edges but dry. 13 years old and holding himself together with both hands. He should have waited for Silas. That was stupid. Yes, Hannah said. He always does that. Just goes. Doesn't ask. I know. It's infuriating. It is, she agreed. And then, because she was his mother and she knew him, you love him very much. Owen looked at her for a moment, and the careful steadiness slipped just slightly, just at the edges, and then he put it back. Someone has to, he said, which was his version of yes. Silas found Cole at the ridge. He had taken shelter in the low overhang of rocks at the east fence line, the same rocks Cole had mentioned to Owen as a possible place to wait out a weather turn. And he was cold and angry at himself and had been sitting with a twisted ankle for 40 minutes. He had in fact found 3 cattle in the drift and gotten them moving toward the barn before the ankle gave way. And he had then sat down and had the kind of conversation with himself that happens when a person has done something genuinely stupid for an almost good reason. When Silas appeared through the white, rope trailing behind him, lamp cutting a small circle of yellow in the gray, Cole felt something collapse in his chest that he hadn't admitted was wound tight. He didn't say anything. Silas didn't say anything either. He looked at Cole's ankle, assessed it the way he assessed everything, without drama, just information, and pulled Cole upright and put Cole's arm across his shoulders, and they started back. The walk back was hard and slow and silent, except for the wind, and Cole was gritting his teeth against the ankle and concentrating on his feet, and at some point he realized that Silas was bearing most of his weight without complaint, without comment, just doing it the same way he did everything else, as if it were simply the next thing that needed doing. When they came through the door and the kitchen came back around them, heat and lamplight and Micah coming off the chair so fast Biscuit fell to the floor, and Eli's face doing something complicated and relieved, and Owen turning from the window and looking at Cole with an expression Cole had never quite seen on his brother's face before. Cole sat down in the nearest chair and did not trust himself to speak. Hannah checked the ankle. Not broken. She wrapped it and made him keep it up and brought him coffee and did not say anything about the cattle he'd gotten out of the drift, and did not say anything about the stupidity of going alone, and did not say anything about anything, just moved around him with practical efficiency until he was warm and stable. And then she went to the window where Silas was standing, looking out at the white, and she said quietly, "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. He found the cattle. He did. 3 head, would have lost them in another hour. I know. Silas was quiet again, then. He went alone because he didn't want to be the one standing around watching. She looked at him. He was still looking out the window. I know that feeling, he said. That was all he said. She thought about the ledger she'd found in the storage room, about 11 years of a man trying to hold something together by himself because there was no one to hold it with him, about how long a person could do that before the doing itself became the only thing they knew. She didn't say any of that. She just stood at the window beside him, and they both looked out at the white until the storm, eventually, got tired of itself. The ankle kept Cole inside for 4 days, which was its own particular punishment for a boy who did not do well sitting still. On the second day, Silas came and sat with him at the kitchen table for an hour, not saying much, just there. And he showed Cole a particular way to splice fence wire that Cole had been doing slightly wrong, doing it slowly so Cole could follow the movement, and Cole paid attention with the kind of attention he gave things that mattered. On the third day, Cole said, without looking up from the wire he was practicing on, "You didn't have to come after me." "No," Silas agreed. "You could have waited for the storm to let up." "Could have." Cole looked up. "Why didn't you?" Silas looked at him for a long moment, not the way adults usually looked at him when they were about to say something significant. No preparation, no gathering of words, just a direct look. "Because you're mine," he said. "Same as those cattle. Same as this land. Mine to look after." Cole held his gaze. Something moved through him, something large enough that he had to look back down at the wire to manage it. His hands kept working. The splice came together cleaner than the last one. "Okay," he said. His voice came out level. He didn't know how. Silas picked up his coffee. "Ankle's better tomorrow. You can start on the south fence." "I'll be there," Cole said. And that was all of it. But it was enough, more than enough. And Cole sat with it the rest of the day like a thing he could actually hold. Owen went to the land office the following Friday, the storm week having forced a delay. Thomas Reeves had been nervous about by letter. Cole went with him, ankle wrapped tight, moving with a slight hitch that he refused to accommodate more than that. Thomas met them at the back door as promised. He was pale and had the look of a man who had been calculating risk for a week and had landed on a decision he wasn't entirely at peace with but was going to hold to anyway. He handed Owen a single folded page. Owen opened it, read it again. "This is a transfer record," Owen said. "Yes. From a Laramie bank. The originating account is registered to Victor Ashcombe personally," Thomas said. "Not the company. Him." He looked at both of them. "That's the piece that doesn't fit with the rest. Everything else he's done goes through intermediaries. That transfer was a mistake. Someone moved money the wrong way, and it came through my office by accident, and I copied it before I understood what I had." Cole was reading over Owen's shoulder. "How much?" Thomas told him the amount. Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's not just cattle money." "No," Thomas said. "That's land money. That's the value of several properties transferred into a private account before those properties were technically sold." He looked at Owen. "Somebody sold land they didn't own yet, or didn't sell land they'd already taken payment for. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what wrong looks like." Owen folded the paper carefully and put it inside his coat. "You're going to have to say this, not just give us a document. You're going to have to stand up and say what you saw." Thomas looked at him. "I know. Ashcombe has people. If he knows you have this, he might already know," Thomas said. Things have been moved in the office again. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way things move when someone's been in them." He exhaled. "Which is why I'd rather have this in your hands than mine right now." Owen nodded. "We're going to file a formal complaint. Through the territorial marshal, not the local office. We're going to need you to be part of it." "I understand. Are you willing?" Thomas looked at the floor and then back up. "My father worked a small ranch south of here for 20 years, he said. Ashcombe bought his water rights 2 years before my father died. Cost him his last good season. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. Yes, I'm willing." The three of them stood in the back hall of the land office, with the cold coming through the door and the paper folded inside Owen's coat, and for a moment nobody said anything. Then Cole said, "Let's go home." Hannah received them at the door before they were off the wagon. She had always done that, known when they were coming, or been in the right place by chance, or some combination of the two that her boys had stopped trying to explain. She looked at Owen's face first. He nodded once, small and certain. She stepped back from the door. At the table, she read the document Thomas had given them. Silas read it after her. Gerald Alderman, who had come for supper that evening because they had learned to move in the same direction now, read it last and set it down and looked at his wife Ruth, who was sitting with her arms folded and her eyes sharp and had not said much since they'd arrived. Ruth Alderman said, "We need to move before he does." "Agreed," Hannah said. "He knows something's happening. Hank Draper is his ears. He's gone, but whatever Draper told him before he left." "We don't know what that was," Silas said. "We know it was enough to spook him," Cole said. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting at the end of the table with his ankle out straight and his arms folded, and he had been quiet through most of the evening, and his quiet now had the same quality Silas's quiet sometimes had, not absence, but attention. "Ashcombe doesn't spook easy," Cole said. "He's been doing this for years, and he's never moved fast. The fact that he ran Hank Draper means he thinks we're close enough to matter, which means we need to do the thing he doesn't expect." "Which is?" Hannah asked. "Stop gathering. Start moving." The table was quiet. Silas looked at Cole for a moment, then at Hannah. "The territorial marshal," Hannah said. "We file with him, not locally. We go over every local head Ashcombe might have influence on, and we go straight to territorial level." "That's a 2-day ride to Cheyenne," Gerald said. "Yes," Hannah said. "Someone needs to make it." Silas said, "I'll go." "You and Gerald," Hannah said. "I'll stay here with the boys and keep things running. Owen, you write out everything we have in order, date by date, the way we've been doing it. Every document, every record, everything Thomas is willing to swear to. Make 2 copies. One goes with Silas, one stays here." What if Ashcombe moves while Silas is gone? Cole asked. Hannah looked at him. Then you and I hold the line. He looked back at her. His jaw was set in the way it had been set on the train the day she'd told him they didn't have better options. But this time there was something different underneath it. Less fear. More something else. Something that looked like the early shape of a man deciding what he was made of. All right, he said. Owen was already reaching for paper. Outside, the Wyoming night was settling into a quiet that felt different from the blizzard quiet. Not the quiet of something pressing in, but the quiet of something that had passed and left the air cleaner, colder, more itself. Silas stood up from the table and went to the window the way he did sometimes, looking out at what was his, what he had held on to through 11 long years of doing it alone. It wasn't his alone anymore. He stood there for a moment and let that settle through him, and then he turned back to the table and sat down and started telling Hannah and Gerald what he knew about the road to Cheyenne, where the stops were, where the weather could trap you, what to bring, how long to allow. He had made that road alone before. This time, when he left, he would be leaving something behind worth coming back to. He did not say that. He was not a man who said things like that. But Hannah, watching him talk about road conditions with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, thought she understood it anyway, the same way she had understood the letter months ago. Come. She had come. And whatever was coming at them next, she intended to still be standing when it arrived. Silas and Gerald left before sunrise on a Monday, which was the kind of decision that made sense logistically and felt wrong in the gut, the way most necessary things did. Hannah stood on the porch and watched them go. Silas had his saddlebags and the document packet Owen had prepared. 2 copies, as instructed. One staying behind in the false bottom of the storage chest that Cole had built specifically for this purpose. Because Cole had turned out to have a talent for woodwork that nobody had known about until he needed it. The copies were written in Owen's careful hand, every date, every record, every line of the transfer document Thomas Reeves had risked himself to provide. Organized the way Owen organized everything, so clearly that even a man who didn't want to understand it would find himself understanding it anyway. Silas had looked at the packet the night before and said, "This is good work, Owen." Owen had said, "I know," and then turned red because that had come out wrong, and Silas had made the face that was almost a smile and let it go. Now he was on his horse in the gray early light, and he looked back once at the porch, at Hannah, and she gave him a single nod. He returned it. Then he and Gerald Alderman rode out through the gate, and the sound of hooves faded into the morning cold, and Hannah stood there until the silence settled back in, and then she went inside. Cole was at the table with coffee, ankle nearly healed, his whole posture carrying the specific weight of the oldest son who now understood exactly what holding the line meant. 2 days there, he said. 2 days back. They'll be gone at least 5. At least, Hannah agreed. Ashcombe's going to notice Silas is gone. He might already know. Men like Ashcombe usually know. She poured her own coffee and sat down. Which is why we don't change anything. Same routine, same work. We don't look like we're waiting for anything. Cole looked at her. Are you afraid? She thought about how to answer that. She had learned with Cole that the honest answer was always better than the reassuring one, because he was 16 and he could tell the difference, and he had stopped trusting the reassuring ones years ago. Yes, she said. But afraid and stopped are different things. He nodded slowly. Okay. He drank his coffee. I'll start on the south fence line after breakfast. Take Owen with you. Owen's not, Take Owen with you, she said again. Not loudly, just the second time. Cole looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face that she hadn't entirely put into words. Then he nodded. Yeah. All right. She did not tell him that she wanted Owen out of the house and in sight of someone she trusted because she did not want to say out loud what she was worried about. She was worried about the spy they hadn't found. The person who had warned Ashcombe before Hank Draper ran. They had never identified who that was, and with Silas gone and the house quiet, she did not want Owen in it alone. She sat with her coffee and did her own calculations. 5 days? Maybe 6. She had to keep everything looking normal for 5 or 6 days while Silas and Gerald made their case to the territorial marshal. After that, whatever happened would happen faster than anything they'd managed so far. and she needed everyone steady until then. She had spent her whole adult life keeping things steady. She could do 5 more days. Victor Ashcombe came on the second day. She had expected him sooner, actually, which meant either he was more patient than she'd given him credit for, or he'd been confirming something before he moved. She was in the yard when his horse came through the gate, and she did not go inside and she did not step back. She had stopped doing those things some time ago. He dismounted with the ease of a man who was comfortable everywhere he went, which was the particular ease of someone who had never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere, and had mistaken that for a fact about the world rather than a fact about his money. He looked at the yard, at the new fence sections, the straightened porch boards, the water-lined stakes. He looked at Cole, who had appeared from around the corner of the barn with a fence tool in his hand and no particular expression on his face. Then he looked at Hannah. Mrs. Whitlock. Same smile as the first time, exactly the same, which told her it wasn't a real smile. Real smiles change slightly depending on the day. Quiet around here today. Silas away? He had business, she said. Long trip? He didn't say. Ashcombe nodded like this was a satisfying answer. She noticed that and filed it. He had wanted to know if Silas was gone, and now he knew, and the nod was involuntary satisfaction, the kind a person showed before they remembered to hide it. I wanted to stop by, he said, because I heard there's been some confusion about some water rights filings in the county. I'd hate for any of that to create misunderstanding between neighbors. What kind of confusion? She asked. Paperwork can be complicated out here. Boundaries shift. Records get imprecise. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable concern. I know Silas has had some questions about the east water access. I want him to know I'm open to discussion. That's all. I'll tell him you said so. I'd rather tell him myself. A pause. You don't know when he'll be back? No, she said, which was true. She didn't know exactly. She just knew approximately. Ashcombe looked at her with something that had slipped in behind the smile, something assessor-like, recalculating. She had the feeling of being looked at not as a person, but as a variable in a problem, a thing to be weighed for how much trouble it might cause. You know, he said conversationally, I respect what you've done here, coming all this way, making something of this place. His voice had warmed in a way that made her more careful, not less. You're a practical woman, I can see that. And a practical woman knows that sometimes the best outcome isn't the one you started out wanting. What outcome are you suggesting? A fair price for this land, for Silas. More than fair. He looked around the yard again. Enough to set up somewhere without the headaches. Somewhere easier than this. His eyes came back to her. For you and your boys. Cole had not moved from the corner of the barn. Hannah could feel him behind her, the way you felt weather before it arrived. I'll pass that along to Silas, Hannah said, when he's back. I hope he doesn't take too long, Ashcombe said pleasantly. The offer has a natural limit, like all things. He remounted without being asked to leave, which was the move of a man who wanted to appear like the departure was his idea. He rode out through the gate without looking back. Hannah waited until he was completely out of sight. Then she said, without turning around, Cole, go check on Owen. She heard him move immediately. No argument. His footsteps quick across the yard toward the south fence, where Owen should have been working, where she needed to know Owen still was. She stood in the yard alone for a moment with her arms at her sides and her hands quiet, and she thought about the phrase natural limit and what it might mean from a man like Victor Ashcombe, and she decided she did not want to find out. She went inside and wrote a letter to Martha Tilden. Martha was at the ranch by the following afternoon, which was faster than Hannah had expected and told her something about Martha that she filed away alongside everything else she'd learned about people in this valley, who moved fast when it mattered and who didn't. They sat at the kitchen table with the boys out working and the house quiet, and Hannah laid out what she needed in plain terms, because she had learned that Martha responded to plain terms better than maneuvering. I need to know who in this valley has been hurt by Ashcombe and is willing to say so, Hannah said. Not just inconvenienced, hurt, lost land, lost water, lost a season they couldn't recover from, I need names, and I need to know if they'd sit in a room together. Martha looked at her for a long moment. You're building something. I'm building a case, which needs more than paper. Paper can be argued with. People standing in front of a marshal's representative, all of them saying the same thing from different places. That's harder to argue with. Ashcombe has lawyers. I know. Good lawyers, ones that have made things go away before. I know that too. Hannah held her gaze. Martha, I'm not asking you to fight him. I'm asking you to tell me who else has reason to. The fighting is already happening. I just need to know who else is in it. Martha was quiet for a while. She was, Hannah had come to understand, a woman who thought before she spoke and meant what she said when she got there, which made her the most useful kind of person in any kind of trouble. Eleanor Price, Martha said finally, the widow north of Alderman's. She signed something 2 years ago she didn't understand. Her boy figured it out afterward, but by then, she stopped. The Hennessy brothers, east of the ridge. They lost a grazing contract that fed their herd 2 winters straight. They've been suspicious, but they didn't have anything to point to. She paused. And Jim Carver. He was Ashcombe's man for 6 years, managed his north operation. He quit 8 months ago and wouldn't say why, and he hasn't spoken to anyone much since. Jim Carver, Hannah said. Where's he now? Got a small place outside of town, just himself. Doesn't come in much. Would he talk to me? Martha looked at her with an expression that was partly admiration and partly the specific worry of someone who cared about the outcome of a thing they couldn't control. I don't know, Jim saw things, I think. Things he's been trying to not have seen. She picked up her coffee cup. You'd have to go to him. He won't come to you. All right. Hannah, Martha set the cup down. If Ashcombe finds out you're gathering people, he's going to find out eventually. The point is to be far enough along by then that it doesn't matter. Martha nodded slowly. When do you need this done? Silas should be back in 3 days. I'd like to have everyone who's willing to talk in the same place within a day of his return, before Ashcombe can react to whatever the marshal's office does. That's fast. Yes, Hannah said. It is. Martha stood up and straightened her coat with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided. I'll start this afternoon, she said. Jim Carver lived in a house that looked like what it was, a place someone was in rather than a place someone had made. Functional and maintained, but without any evidence of intention beyond the next season. Hannah rode out to it alone, which Cole had not been happy about, and she had told him she needed to go alone because a woman showing up by herself was less threatening than a woman with a 16-year-old standing behind her, and Cole had said that was the most frustrating logic he'd ever heard, and she'd said she knew, and she'd gone anyway. Carver came to the door before she knocked. He'd heard the horse. He was maybe 50, broad through the shoulders, with the hands of a man who had done outdoor work his whole life, and the face of one who had recently stopped sleeping well. He looked at her for a moment. You're the woman from Boone's place. Hannah Whitlock. Yes. He didn't invite her in. He stood in the doorway. What do you want? I want to know what you saw when you worked for Victor Ashcombe. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen and had not known if it ever would. I heard you've been asking around, he said. Martha Tilden mentioned you. Martha talks too much. She talks exactly enough. Hannah stood her ground on the step below him. Mr. Carver, I'm not here to put you in a position you haven't chosen, but I need to know what you know, and I think you need to tell someone what you know. And right now, I'm what's available. He looked past her at the empty road, like he was checking it. Old habit, she thought. The habit of someone who had spent years in a place where being seen talking to the wrong person had consequences. Come in, he said. But he talked for 2 hours. He told it in the flat, careful way of a man who had organized his account of things a long time ago, in the private space of his own head, and who was now reading from that organization rather than discovering it fresh. He had witnessed cattle being moved off the Boone property over a period of 18 months. He had seen Hank Draper take money directly from Ashcombe's foreman, a man named Curtis Wells, on 3 separate occasions. He had been present when Ashcombe described his method to his inner circle, the specific method of small, slow, legal-looking moves that would never individually rise to the level of a crime, but collectively amounted to the dismantling of every independent ranch in the Northern Valley. He called it consolidation, Carver said. He said it like it was a business word, like it was just efficiency. He looked at his hands on the table. I told myself for years it was just hard business. Competition. That's what he called it. Competition. What changed? Hannah asked. Eleanor Price's boy. He said it simply. He was 15 when she signed that water rights amendment. He didn't understand it, and she didn't understand it, and Curtis Wells sat at her table and told her it was just a formality, and she signed it because she was a widow, and she was tired, and she trusted a man at her table. He paused. I was in the yard. I wasn't in the room, but I knew what was in that document. He looked up. I didn't go in and stop it. The kitchen was quiet. I quit 8 months later, he said. Took me 8 months to quit. That's what I have to live with. Hannah looked at him steadily. Are you willing to say all of this in front of a marshal? I've been willing for 8 months, he said. I just didn't know who to say it to. She reached into her coat and put Owen's copied documents on the table between them. Read through these. Tell me what matches what you saw. She stood up. I'll come back tomorrow. She left him reading at his kitchen table, and she rode back to the ranch in the afternoon cold with something in her chest that was not quite relief. Relief was too clean for what this was, but was close to the feeling that comes when a puzzle piece you thought was lost turns up in an unexpected place. It didn't mean they'd won. It meant the shape of what they were building was finally visible. Silas came back on the 5th day late afternoon, and he was not alone. There was a man with him that Hannah didn't recognize. Compact, gray-mustached, riding a horse that was better than average, and wearing a coat that was not frontier practical, but had not been chosen for appearance either. The kind of coat that said, I travel for work, and I have done it long enough to know what works. Cole saw them coming and came to the porch, and Hannah stepped out beside him, and Silas came through the gate and dismounted and looked at her with something in his face that she had learned to read in the past months. Not his rare, almost smile, not the flat control of a difficult day, but something quieter and harder to name. Something that might have been the look of a man who had been fighting alone for so long that realizing he had reinforcements required a moment of private adjustment. Hannah, he said, this is Deputy Marshal Charles Ennis, Territorial Office. Ennis dismounted and tipped his hat. Mrs. Whitlock, I've heard considerable about you in the last 2 days. Good or bad? She asked. Both, he said, which she appreciated. Mostly good. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had happened, where Owen had spread his records, and Ruth Alderman had read them, and Thomas Reeves had become real to them through Gerald's recounting, and Silas had finally said, All right, what do you need from me? Hannah thought about that table sometimes, how much it had held. Gerald Alderman arrived within the hour, because Hannah had sent Eli on the fast horse the moment Silas's dust appeared on the road, because Eli was the fastest rider of the boys, and took the job with characteristic enthusiasm. Eleanor Price came with Gerald, which was not planned, but which meant someone had already been talking and the word was moving faster than Hannah had organized it, which was fine. Better than fine. Jim Carver arrived last, after dark, which meant he had decided and then reconsidered and then decided again, and Hannah respected that process even if the timing was difficult. Marshal Ennis sat at the table with Owen's documents in front of him for a long time. He asked specific questions in a specific order that told Hannah he had done this before. Not this exact situation, but this kind of situation. The kind where a pattern of small legal wrongs added up to something that required untangling, rather than direct confrontation. He asked Thomas Reeves's name, and Owen provided it along with the copy of Thomas's transfer document, and Ennis looked at that document for a long time without saying anything. This is the direct line, Ennis said finally. Yes, Owen said. Ennis looked at him. You organized all of this? My mother organized it. I wrote it down. Ennis glanced at Hannah. She said nothing. Ennis looked back at the documents. "Jim Carver," he said, "you're willing to testify to what you witnessed." "Yes," Carver said. He was sitting straight in the chair, the particular straightness of a person who had made a decision and was not going to let it become comfortable. "Curtis Wells, Ashcomb's foreman. You saw him transfer money to Hank Draper. 3 times. Dates and amounts in the record Owen made. I confirmed them. Draper is gone." "Draper ran," Silas said. "Which tells you he knows what he was part of." Ennis nodded slowly. He put the documents into a particular order that was his own, which meant he was building his own understanding of the sequence, which was a good sign. "I'm going to need 2 days," he said. "I have a colleague in the county who I trust, and I need to move through the proper filings without alerting Ashcomb's people in the local office before we're ready. If any of this gets out early, it won't come from us," Hannah said. "What about the clerk? Reeves?" "Thomas is solid," Owen said. Ennis looked at him again with the expression adults sometimes gave Owen, the one that recalibrated slightly, adjusting for more than they'd expected to find. 2 days, Ennis said. "Nobody moves. Nobody goes to Ashcombe. Nobody sends word. Nobody does anything that deviates from a normal week. Can you hold 2 more days?" He looked at Silas when he asked it. Silas looked at Hannah. "We've held this long," she said. The 2 days were the hardest days. Not because anything happened, because nothing happened, which in its own way was worse. The specific tension of people keeping still when everything in them wanted to move. Cole worked the fence with a focus that went past productivity into the territory of physical management of something mental. Owen read, which was his version of the same thing. Eli fed Biscuit extra biscuits because Biscuit was confused by the tension in the house, and Eli could not tolerate confused things without trying to fix them. Micah stayed close to Silas. This had been true for months, the way Micah had attached to Silas with the matter-of-fact completeness that very young children attach to things they had decided about. But during those 2 days, it became something more deliberate. When Silas went to the barn, Micah went to the barn. When Silas checked the water line, Micah was 4 steps behind him. When Silas sat on the porch in the evening and looked out at the darkening land, Micah sat beside him. On the second evening, Hannah watched them from the window, the man and the small boy, side by side on the porch in the last light, not talking, just sitting. And she thought about what it cost a child to lose a father, and what it cost a man to lose the only version of a family he'd managed to build before it fell apart, which was the story she'd pieced together from things Silas had said in fragments over months, never the whole shape, just edges. She didn't go out to them. That moment was theirs. Cole appeared beside her at the window, and she hadn't heard him come in, which was happening more often lately. Cole moving quietly, taking up less deliberate space, the sharp edges of his anxiety slowly rounding into something more like steadiness. He looked at the porch, at Silas and Micah. "You know Micah calls him Pa," Cole said. In his head. "I heard him tell Biscuit." Hannah looked at him. Cole was still looking out the window. "Does that bother you?" she asked carefully. Cole was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. Then, "It used to. A little. At the beginning." He exhaled. "But Micah was 3 when Dad started getting sick. He doesn't have the same—" He stopped, tried again. "Silas is the first man who's been around enough for Micah to actually know. So." Hannah nodded. "I think Dad would have liked him," Cole said. He said it quietly and without sentimentality, just as an assessment, the way Cole made assessments, seriously and after consideration. Dad liked people who did things without making a production of it. She thought about James Whitlock, who had been a good man and not careful with money, and who had loved his boys in the uncomplicated way that was his nature. And she thought about how loss worked, not replacing things, but accumulating alongside them, the new things not smaller than the old things, but different. "I think so too," she said. Cole nodded. He poured himself coffee and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Hannah stood at the window a moment longer, then turned away. Tossant. Ennis moved on the 3rd morning. He had 2 men with him from the county seat, plus a 3rd Hannah didn't know, a territorial attorney named Sloan, who had the look of a man who enjoyed complicated paper problems and had been given a very good one. They served papers on the Ashcombe Ranch at 7 in the morning, which was before Ashcombe would have been expecting anything, and after Ennis had already filed the formal suspension of the contested land and water claims at the county office through his trusted colleague, bypassing entirely the channels where Ashcombe had influence. Silas was not there for the serving of papers. Ennis had told him explicitly not to be. You have an interest in this outcome, and I need you nowhere near it when it happens, because a man with your interest showing up at Ashcombe's gate gives his lawyers something to work with. Silas had not liked this. He had sat with it and accepted it, which was its own kind of difficult thing for a man who had spent 11 years handling things himself. He was at the east fence line with Cole when word came back. It came through Martha Tilden, who had heard from the blacksmith, who had been in town when the marshal's party rode through. And Martha sent her nephew on a horse, and the nephew arrived at the ranch mid-morning, and the information he carried was this. Curtis Wells had been at the Ashcombe property when Ennis arrived. He had been served as a secondary respondent on 2 of the criminal counts. He had, by the time the marshal's party was remounting, already requested to make a separate statement, which meant Wells had looked at the papers, and the papers had told him what was coming, and he had made the calculation that 8 years working for Victor Ashcombe was not worth what was now being asked of him, and he had stepped to the other side. Hannah read the message twice. She set it on the table. Wells is talking, she said. Owen looked up from the window where he'd been watching the road. That's it. That's the main structure gone, she said. Without Wells and Carver and Thomas, Ashcombe has paper and lawyers. With all 3 talking, he has a problem that lawyers can't paper over. Eli appeared in the doorway from outside. What happened? Something good, Hannah said. Eli waited for more. She looked at him, 10 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hair going everywhere and mud on his boots and Biscuit behind him. Significantly good, she added. His face broke into the particular Eli grin that had been filling this kitchen for months. The one that had started as a nervous habit and somewhere along the way had become simply who he was in this house. The person who grinned when something good happened and didn't ration it. Do we celebrate? He asked. Not yet, she said, but soon. Ashcombe came himself the next morning. He came without his foreman, which was the first sign that something had changed in his calculation of the situation. He came without the comfortable smile, which was the second. He rode to the gate and stopped there, which was different from how he'd always ridden in before, like the property's boundaries had begun to mean something to him that they hadn't before. Silas walked to the gate. Hannah came as far as the porch. Cole stood at the corner of the barn. Ashcombe looked at Silas across the gate for a long moment. You went to the territorial marshal, he said. I did, Silas said. That was a mistake. I don't think so. Ashcombe's jaw was tight in a way she had never seen from him. The specific tightness of a man whose composure was a thing he maintained deliberately and who was now having to work for it. You have a woman and 4 boys on this property. You want to consider what you're starting. I want you to hear something, Silas said. His voice was level and quiet. Not aggressive, just completely certain. Whatever you're considering, whatever you think your next step is, there is nothing you can do to this property from the outside that will change what Marshal Ennis has already filed. There is nothing you can do to me or mine that will unfile it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You can't prove Wells is talking, Silas said. Jim Carver is talking. Thomas Reeves has been talking for a week. And every property owner in this valley who you've put a filing against is prepared to appear and say what happened to them, in the same room, at the same time. Ashcombe's horse shifted. He steadied it without looking down. This doesn't end the way you think it does, he said. I think it ends with you answering for what you've done, Silas said. I think that's exactly how it ends. Ashcombe looked past Silas at Hannah on the porch. She held his gaze without expression. He looked at Cole at the corner of the barn. Cole returned it the same way. Something went out of Ashcombe's face. Not the arrogance exactly. That was too ingrained to go all at once. But the certainty, the quality of a man who had always believed the ground was solid under him because he had arranged the ground himself. That went out of his face, and what was under it was older and less polished. He turned his horse and rode out through the gate without another word. Silas watched him go. Hannah watched Silas watch him go. When the road was empty, Silas turned around and walked back across the yard and up the 2 porch steps, and he stood there for a moment with the morning air moving around them, and he put his hand on the porch post, the one Cole had repaired in the first week, and he looked at Hannah. "Is it over?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said. "His lawyers will take time. There'll be hearings. It won't be fast. But the worst of it is done." She looked out at the yard, at Cole coming away from the barn, at Owen appearing around the side of the house from wherever he'd been positioned, at Eli visible through the kitchen window where he'd been keeping Micah occupied. "We have enough, more than enough. He can fight the paper, but he can't fight all of it, not with his own people testifying against him." Silas nodded. He was still looking out at the yard, at her boys moving through it like they'd always been here, like this land already knew them. "Hannah," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, not the old quiet, the one that had kept its distance. Something different. Something that was making itself ready for a thing it wasn't entirely sure how to do. "I'm glad you came," he said. It was not perhaps what another man might have said in that moment. It did not encompass everything it was trying to say. But Hannah had read his first letter, which had also not encompassed everything it was trying to say, and she had understood that one too. "I'm glad I came," she said. Inside the kitchen, through the window, Eli had apparently told Micah that something good had happened, because Micah's laugh came through the glass, small and high and completely unguarded, and Biscuit barked once in response, and Cole came up the porch steps and stood beside Silas without saying anything. And the morning held all of it, the hard months and the cold and the fear and the work and everything they had built out of those things. And it was not perfect, and it was not finished, and there was still a road of hearings and lawyers and long, slow legal process ahead of them. But Ashcombe had ridden away, and they were still standing. The lawyers took 4 months. That was the part nobody told you about when you imagined justice. That it moved at the speed of paperwork, which was slower than weather and nearly as unpredictable. Marshal Ennis had said there would be hearings, and he had been right. And those hearings were held in a county building in Cheyenne that smelled like old wood and lamp oil and the accumulated weight of disputes. And the people sitting in that building had to say their piece and then wait while men in good coats argued about the piece they'd said and what it meant and what could be proven versus what could be inferred. And the whole machinery of territorial law ground forward at exactly its own pace, regardless of what anyone needed from it. Silas attended the first hearing with Gerald Alderman and Jim Carver. Hannah stayed at the ranch because someone had to, and because she had learned that her presence in official rooms sometimes caused men to direct their questions to Silas about things she had organized herself, which wasted everyone's time and raised her blood pressure in a way that was not useful. Cole had suggested carefully that this was perhaps not fair. Hannah had agreed that it was not fair, and had stayed home anyway, because fair and strategic were different categories. She kept the ranch running. That was what she did for 4 months while the legal machinery did its grinding. She managed the cattle count, which was hers now as much as Silas's, the numbers living in her head alongside everything else she carried. She kept Owen's records updated as new information came through Ennis, and information did come through regularly because Ennis had turned out to be the kind of man who communicated with the people whose testimony he was using, which was not universal among men in his position and which Hannah appreciated specifically. Curtis Wells's statement had been the structural collapse Silas had predicted it would be. He had laid out, in the particular detail of a man who had managed operations directly, the full mechanism of what Ashcombe had been running, the cattle theft through Hank Draper, the fraudulent filings through connections in the land office who were not Thomas Reeves, but 2 others who had been quietly removed by the time the hearings began, and most critically, the private transfer of funds that Owen's copied document had pointed to, which Wells confirmed came from a Laramie bank account that Ashcombe controlled personally. The brother-in-law in Laramie, when formally contacted, had been cooperative with what Hannah could only describe as the speed of a man who had been waiting to be given a reason to stop pretending. He had signed a declaration within the week. His cooperation reduced his own exposure, and he knew it. But Hannah had stopped caring about the purity of people's motives sometime around the 3rd fence cutting. What mattered was what they said, and whether it was true, and his declaration was true. She could see it fit against everything else they had. Thomas Reeves testified in the second hearing. Owen asked Hannah afterward how Thomas had seemed because Owen had not been allowed in the room. He was 13, and his role had been evidence organizer, not witness, which Ennis had explained was both practical and protective. He seemed like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally putting it down, Hannah said. Owen thought about this. Was he scared? Yes, she said. He did it anyway. Owen nodded like this confirmed something he'd already decided about Thomas, filed it away, and went back to what he'd been reading. The news about Ashcombe came on a Tuesday in late January because apparently Tuesdays had decided to be Hannah's significant days in both directions. Ennis sent word by messenger, a young man who rode hard from the county seat and arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon with cold-bitten ears and a letter that Hannah read on the porch in the winter light. Victor Ashcombe had fled the territory. He had not waited for the final hearing. His attorneys had attended 2 days prior and requested a continuance, which Ennis had denied, and the following morning Ashcombe's house had been found empty of its owner, though not of its contents. He had taken what he could carry on short notice, which meant he had known this moment was coming and had been calculating how long he could hold on before the calculation changed. His financial assets in the territory were frozen pending the fraud determinations. His land claims, the legitimate ones as well as the fraudulent ones, pending review, were suspended. Every filing he had made in the past 3 years was under examination. His attorneys, finding themselves with a client who had absconded, had filed to withdraw from the case within 48 hours of his disappearance, which was lawyers doing the math on their own situation and arriving at the sensible answer. Hannah read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the porch step, which was cold, and she didn't care, and she sat there for a minute without thinking anything in particular, just sitting with the fact of it. Biscuit came and sat beside her, the way he came when someone was still. He put his heavy, ugly head on her knee and looked out at the yard with her, and she put her hand on his back without thinking about it. Cole found her there when he came in from the fence line. He read her face before she could say anything. "It's done?" he said. "He's gone. The claims are frozen. Ennis says the fraud determinations will take another few months, but the outcome isn't in question anymore." She looked up at her son. "It's done, Cole." He stood for a moment. He was almost 17 now, and somewhere in the past 8 months he had crossed some line that boys crossed when enough had been asked of them. He stood differently than he had on the train. Still had his father's jaw and his father's stubbornness, but they sat on him differently now, settled rather than braced. He sat down on the step beside her. They were quiet for a while. "I thought about what you said on the train," he said, way back at the beginning, that we didn't have better options. "I remember. I hated that. I hated that it was true and that you just said it like that, like there wasn't anything to soften it. There wasn't. I know." He turned the fence pliers he was still holding in his hands. "But I've been thinking. It wasn't just that we didn't have better options. We had this option, and this—" He stopped, looked out at the yard, the fence, the water line, the barn, the land rolling away in the January light. This wasn't nothing. Right from the start, it wasn't nothing. Hannah looked at him. "I was so sure he was going to be wrong," Cole said. "Silas, I was sure there was going to be something wrong with him, because nothing that came to us easy ever—" He stopped again. He wasn't easy, but he was right. "He is," she said. Cole looked at her. "Are you happy, Mama?" It was the kind of question that could have been asked carelessly and wasn't. He was asking it the way he asked things he had thought about for a long time, with weight behind it. She thought about James, who had been her first life, and was finished now in all the ways that mattered, except memory. She thought about the boarding house, and the bank man, and the letter she'd almost burned. She thought about a kitchen table that had held so much over 8 months that it ought to have had a different shape by now. "Yes," she said, "I am." Cole nodded. He stood up, put the pliers in his coat pocket, and went inside to tell the others. Silas asked her on a Friday evening in February, which was nobody's significant day, and which she thought afterward was probably why he chose it. The boys were all in the house, Cole and Owen at the table doing something with the account ledger that Owen had been teaching Cole to read the way he read everything, systematically and with full comprehension. Eli asleep on the bench near the stove with Biscuit on his feet. Micah already in bed. The house was warm and smelled like the supper they'd finished an hour ago, and Silas had come in from his last check of the horses and stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he sometimes did, like he was taking the count of the room. He said, "Hannah, come outside a minute." Owen looked up. Cole did not look up, but his ears changed. Hannah wiped her hands on her cloth and went. It was cold on the porch, but the sky was clear and enormous, the way it was on clear winter nights in Wyoming. Stars all the way to the edge of things, and she could see her breath, and his breath, and the distant line of the ridge that she had looked at on the first evening and thought was painted. Silas stood at the porch rail. He was not a man who prepared speeches, and so he did not give one. He turned and looked at her and said, "I want to ask you something." "All right? And I want you to know that whatever you say, it doesn't change anything that already is. The ranch is yours as much as mine. The boys are—" He stopped, started again. "This is your home. That's not the question." She waited. He looked at her directly, the way he always did when he was saying something that mattered. "Will you marry me? Not because it makes sense, not because it's practical, because I don't want to be without you. And I should have said that a long time ago, and I'm saying it now." The night was very quiet around them. She thought about a widow on a train with 4 boys and a trunk and a letter from a man she'd never met. She thought about all the things she had not known she was riding toward, the kitchen table and the water line and the blizzard and the fence, and the man standing in front of her who had gone out in that blizzard without putting on a second layer because a boy he'd known for 2 months was lost in it. She thought about the fact that she had been afraid every single day since the bankman came, a low steady, afraid that she had managed and organized and never let stop her, and that somewhere in the past few months, she could not have said exactly when, that afraid had gone quiet, not because the world had gotten safer. The world had not gotten safer, because she was not in it alone. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, just slightly, just enough to tell her he had not been certain, which she hadn't known she needed to know, but found that she did, that he had been standing out here in the cold genuinely not knowing, genuinely asking. He did not make a production of it. He put his hand over hers on the rail, and they stood there for a minute in the cold and the starlight and the quiet, and it was not a romantic moment in the way that story got told. It was a real moment, which was better and also more ordinary, 2 people who had built something real together deciding to say so out loud. Inside, through the window, Owen said to Cole, clearly audible, "They've been out there a while." Cole said, "Owen." "What?" "Leave it alone." A pause. "Do you think he asked her?" Owen, "Leave it alone." Hannah heard this and put her other hand over her mouth for a moment, and Silas made the sound that was almost a laugh, and the night held all of it. They told the boys at breakfast. Eli's response was immediate and vocal and involved knocking over his coffee, which was classic Eli. Owen nodded once and said, "Good," with the satisfaction of a mathematician whose answer has been confirmed. Cole looked at Silas for a moment and then at Hannah and then back at Silas and extended his hand across the table, a handshake, formal and deliberate. Silas shook it. Whatever passed between them in that moment was theirs, and Hannah did not try to name it. Micah listened to the announcement with the focused attention he brought to all information, processing it, testing it against what he already knew. Then he looked at Silas and said, "So now you're our pa, for real?" Silas looked at him. "That's up to you," he said. "It's always been up to you." Micah seemed to consider this bureaucratic position briefly and find it satisfactory. "Okay," he said. "Pa," like he was trying the word in his mouth to confirm it tasted the way he expected. He picked up his fork and went back to his eggs. Owen, very quietly and without any particular expression, reached under the table and found Hannah's hand and held it for a moment and let it go. She pressed his hand back before he took it away. Oh. The formal fraud determination came through in March, 4 months after the first hearing, which was faster than Ennis had predicted and slower than everyone had hoped for, which was exactly how legal machinery operated. The determinations were comprehensive. Every fraudulent filing Ashcombe had made was vacated. The water rights he had manipulated on the Price land and the Alderman land and 4 other properties were restored to their original holders. The cattle theft was quantified and a damages claim was filed against his frozen assets, which would take another year to fully resolve, but would resolve in favor of the valley's ranchers. Victor Ashcombe's whereabouts remained unknown. There was a warrant. Ennis said these things sometimes resolved and sometimes didn't, and he said it without false comfort, which Hannah appreciated. The man was gone. The damage he had done was not undone by his going, but it was stopped, and the people he had been dismantling had been given back what could be given back. Eleanor Price, on the day her water rights were formally restored, came to the ranch to tell Hannah herself. She was 63 and had worked her land alone for 8 years, and she stood in the kitchen and held Hannah's hand for a moment before she said anything, and Hannah held hers back. "I want to say thank you," Eleanor said. "I know you'll say it wasn't just you." "It wasn't," Hannah said. "I know, but it started with you, with your boy finding what he found and you deciding to do something about it." She looked at Hannah steadily. "I was going to let it go. I was so tired. And then you sent that letter through Martha, and I thought, if a woman who has been here 8 months is not willing to let it go, then I have no excuse." Hannah thought about that for a while after Eleanor left, about what it meant to not let something go, not just for yourself, but because other people were watching what you would do and deciding from it what they could do. She hadn't thought about it that way at the time. She had just thought about her boys and Silas and the land and the clear wrongness of a man who believed he could take whatever he had the cleverness to take. But maybe those were the same thing. Maybe doing something hard for your own reasons ended up being the thing that made it possible for someone else to do something hard for theirs. She didn't know. She was not a philosopher. She was a woman who had learned to do what was in front of her and not stop. The wedding was in April, in the yard, because the house was too small and they were not church people, and the yard was where everything real had happened anyway. Martha Tilden organized more of it than Hannah had asked her to, which was Martha's nature and which Hannah had learned to accept as the form Martha's affection took. There were tables set up and food that involved more people than Hannah had realized were willing to come until they showed up. The Aldermans, Eleanor Price, the Hennessy brothers who had barely spoken to anyone outside their own family for 2 years, Thomas Reeves, who had made the ride from town with the particular expression of a man attending something he had helped make possible and was glad of. Jim Carver came. He stood on the edge of things the way he always stood, not quite inside the gathering, but there. Hannah made a point of going to him before the ceremony. "I'm glad you're here," she said. He nodded, looked at his hat in his hands. "I should have done something sooner," he said, which was a thing he had said before and which Hannah suspected he would say for the rest of his life, regardless of what anyone told him. "You did it when you did it," she said. "That's what there is." He looked up. "Your boy, Owen, he's got a gift." "I know." "You should send him to study. Law, maybe. Something that uses what's in his head." He paused. "He's the one who actually cracked it open, you know, not me. I just confirmed what he'd already found." Hannah looked across the yard at Owen, who was talking to Thomas Reeves with the intense focus he brought to conversations with people who knew things he didn't yet know. She thought about what Owen had said the night before, when she'd asked him what he wanted, really wanted, for the years ahead. He had said, "I want to understand how the law works, not just read about it. Understand it so I can use it." And then, with the directness that was his particular version of Cole's stubbornness, "I think I want to be a lawyer." She had looked at her 13-year-old son and thought about the ledger she'd found in the storage room and all the dominoes that had fallen from that finding, and she had thought, "Yes, probably you do." "I know," she told Carver. "We're working on it." No. The ceremony itself was short, which suited both of them. There was a circuit judge who came through Coldwater Creek twice a year and happened to be due through in April, which was what passed for timing in this part of the world. He was a practical man who said the practical words and did not elaborate on them unnecessarily, and Silas said yes, and Hannah said yes, and the yard full of people said nothing because they were all listening, and it was done. Cole shook Silas's hand again after, the same formal handshake as breakfast in February, and then did something Hannah had not expected. He pulled Silas into a brief, hard embrace, the kind that lasted exactly long enough and no longer, the kind that said what 16-year-old boys with their father's stubbornness could not say in other forms. Silas's hand came up and gripped Cole's shoulder for that moment, and then they stepped back from each other and looked at different parts of the yard, and neither of them said anything, and that was the right way for it to happen. Eli made a toast that was too long and very funny and involved an extended story about Biscuit that was only tangentially related to the occasion, and everyone laughed, and Biscuit, hearing his name, stood up from under the table and looked around with dignified confusion. Micah sat next to Silas through all of it, dinner and the toasts and the late afternoon winding down, with his shoulder pressed against Silas's arm the way he had been pressing it for months, the way children pressed against things they had decided were solid. At one point, late in the afternoon when the gathering had softened into the easy noise of people who had been fed and were not in any hurry, Hannah watched Silas put his hand briefly on the back of Micah's head. Not a pat, not a ruffle, just a steady touch. And Micah leaned into it slightly, without looking up from what he was doing. She looked away. Some things you didn't need to watch. You just needed to know they were happening. But summer came the way Wyoming summers came, fast and bright, and with opinions about itself. The ranch ran differently than it had a year ago, which was the point of all of it. The water line ran clean, the fence held, the cattle count was accurate for the first time in years because Owen had reorganized the recording system in a way that made inconsistencies visible at a glance, and nobody was going to use the Boone Ranch's own sloppiness against them again. Cole had taken over the East Pasture management, which was his now in the specific way that things became yours when you have fixed them and fought for them and nearly frozen to death checking on them. He was 17 and ran it with the particular seriousness of someone who had decided this was what he was going to be good at, and he was already good at it. Owen had written to a law office in Cheyenne. Thomas Reeves had given him the name of a man who occasionally took on apprentices, and Owen had written the letter himself without asking Hannah to approve the draft, and shown it to her only after he'd sent it. She had read it and told him it was well written. He had said he knew. She had laughed, which surprised them both. The letter back had arrived in June. There was interest. There were details to discuss. Owen was 13 and would need to be older before anything formal could be arranged. But there was interest, and interest from the right place was how everything started. The neighboring ranches had steadied. The aldermans had a good season without the water dispute bleeding them. Eleanor Price hired a hand for the first time in 3 years because the restored water rights meant her north pasture was viable again. The Hennessy brothers, who had barely left their land in 2 years, started coming to town on Fridays, which was a small thing that was not small. Coldwater Creek was not transformed. It was still a town that was still deciding whether to exist, with its unpaved roads and its limited supplies and its particular frontier combination of hardship and community. But it was different in the way places became different when people in them stopped being afraid of a specific thing, less tight, less watchful, more willing to be in it together. Hannah felt that difference every time she went to town. Not in any one thing, just in the air of it. In August, she found herself standing at the kitchen window again, the same window where so much of the watching had happened, the window she'd looked through to see Cole cross the yard toward Silas on the second morning, to see Silas go out in the blizzard, to see Ashcombe ride away. The window had held a year's worth of watching in its glass. Silas came in from the morning and found her there. He had flour on his hands because he had taken up bread making in the particular unexpected way that people revealed themselves over time. Silas Boone, who had spent 11 years eating whatever required the least trouble, had started making bread sometime in the spring and was better at it than anyone had expected, including himself. He stood beside her at the window and looked out at what she was looking at, which was the yard and the fence and the water line, and beyond that the rolling land and the mountain ridge that still looked painted in certain light. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She thought about it honestly before she answered, the way she did most things. "I was thinking about the letter," she said. "Your letter, the first one. How short it was." "I didn't know what to say." "You said exactly what needed saying." He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure you'd come. After I sent it, I thought, a woman with 4 sons, she has to be careful. She has to think about what she's riding toward. I did think about it. And? And you said come like you meant it, and not like you meant come, but be aware of the conditions. She looked at him. That's the whole thing, Silas. That's what the whole year has been, really. You meant it. He looked at her in the direct way he had, the one that didn't look away. I did, he said. Outside, Biscuit was barking at something in the yard with the outrage of a dog who had appointed himself guardian of a larger territory than he could reasonably manage. Eli's voice called to him from somewhere near the barn, and the barking subsided into grumbling and then into silence. Cole's voice came from the east fence, too far to hear the words but clear enough to hear the tone of someone giving direction, someone who had figured out what they knew and was comfortable saying it. Owen was at the table behind them, writing, as Owen was always writing now, letters, records, the careful accumulation of a boy building toward the person he intended to be. And Micah, 7 years old, and certain of very little except the things he had decided, came through the back door with his boots on the wrong feet and mud up to his knees and a completely clear conscience about both, and he looked at Silas and said, Pa, Biscuit found something dead in the south corner, with the tone of someone reporting weather. Silas exhaled through his nose. Show me. It smells bad. I expect it does. Really bad. Micah. Okay. He turned and went back out. Silas followed him, picking up his hat from the hook without breaking stride. The motion of a man who knew what his days held and had made his peace with what they held and was going to do them anyway. Hannah watched them go across the yard together, the man and the small boy with his boots on the wrong feet, and she thought about what she had told Cole on the train when he'd asked if she was afraid. Afraid and stopped are different things. She had been afraid every day for a year, in one form or another, and she had not stopped, and this was what the not stopping had made. Not a perfect thing, not a finished thing. There was no such thing as finished. There was only the next fence, and the next season, and the next letter from Owen's law contact, and the next thing Eli knocked over, and the next conversation with Cole that started sideways and ended honest. But it was hers. All of it was hers. The hard parts and the good parts, and the yard and the ridge, and the kitchen table, and the 4 boys who had come with her on a train to Wyoming with nothing but what they could carry, and the man who had answered her letter when 11 others hadn't. The ranch was not the most beautiful place she had ever seen. It was not the easiest place she had ever lived. The winters were long and the work was constant, and the mud in spring was something she would never fully come to terms with. But she had come here with nothing, and she had built something real, and the people inside it were real, and the land under them was solid, and that was not a small thing. That was everything. She turned from the window and went to the table and sat down across from Owen, and he looked up from his writing, and she said, "Let me see what you're working on." He pushed the pages toward her. She read. Outside, the summer morning moved across the land the way mornings did out here, big and unhurried, like it had enough time for all of it. It did.